There's not much left unsaid about one Stephen King, is there? The man is as popular as he is prolific. Almost too prolific if you ask me. Not only is the breadth of King's work expansive, it's also notoriously long. When you see novels like It and The Stand's page count landing somewhere in the thousands, it's just not an easy ask for your average Johnny to sit down and read them all cover to cover. That's where the classic film adaptation comes into play. An easy to digest attempt at mass appeal, and for the most part, these have been a resounding success. King's work was already a massive hit with general audiences, so bringing that into the realm of film kind of seems like a no-brainer. And yet, it's not just how many of King's novels have received the Hollywood treatment that's impressive, but it's the profound influence on popular culture that some adaptations have that truly gets my attention. Films like The Shining have such an impact on both audiences and creatives alike that it's almost become impossible to really quantify. Characters like Carrie White and Pennywise have wormed their way into the DNA of popular culture to the point where if any story has a bully teenager with special powers or a scary clown, they end up drawing immediate comparisons to the works of King. But where there's one success, there's bound to be countless failures. That is why I decided to embark on this journey, one of pure curiosity and blatant stupidity. While the result of adapting most of King's work has been a net positive on popular culture, that doesn't mean there aren't some stinkers in there. Not everything can be a Shawshank Redemption or a Pet Sematary. For every good retelling, there lies a much nastier, much fouler one hidden amongst the shadows of time. The purpose of this series is to catalog and have a frank discussion about what I believe makes an adaptation of King's written works succeed or fail, and maybe take a few cheap shots here along the way, who knows. By my criteria, we have approximately 76 different movies, miniseries, segments and anthology films, and episodes of television to get through, so I'm going to need to set a few ground rules before we get started. First and foremost, this is not meant to be a series comparing and contrasting adaptations to their novel counterparts. I do not have the time to read basically everything the man wrote, but that does not preclude me from mentioning them if I find it necessary. Don't worry, I'll let you know what I did and didn't read when it becomes relevant so that I can get my special Pizza Hut pizza coupon. They still give those out, right? Like even if you're 24. Rule 2, somewhat following Rule 1, an adaptation doesn't need to be 100% accurate for it to be good. They don't get extra points if they somehow perfectly captured what kind of fabric the drapes were on page 1285. What we're looking for is how an adaptation stands on its own and what it brings to the table as an interpretation of the original work. But if an adaptation is fairly accurate, I'll try and go out of my way to explain how this helps or hurts it as a whole. Rule 3. The formatting of these videos are going to be like multiple reviews/analyses presented back to back to back and so on. Despite the fact that I will be trying to reference things here and there, if you just want to watch an individual review on one of these, then just skip around, they're on the timecode below. Finally, I give myself the out whenever I don't find this fun anymore. The second these videos become boring or tedious to make, I'm out, and there's no question about it. I'm not going to hold myself to do a near 20-part series if I'm not having fun with it. That's a problem for future, Michael, so I'm just going to give you some insight into the order of these and then we're going to get into it. I'm going to go chronologically, but I'm going to group all direct remakes with each other. What this means is we're going to start with Carrie 1976, go to Carrie 2002, then Carrie 2013, before we get to Salem's Lot 1979, and then do that remake in 2004. Does that make sense? The purpose of this is so that we can see in order what people thought was worth adapting between each adaptation. And you could also see the trends that change as each one comes out decades apart. And this should go without saying, but we're only covering things that were directly adapted from King's novels and short stories. No Storm of the Century, because that was like a screenplay that got turned into a novel, that got turned into a screenplay. Not doing it, don't feel like it, next. Also, no sequels. That means all the Children of the Corns, get out. Thank God. And there's like one exception I have for this, but we might never even get to it. And if we do, hey, it'll be worth it. So for now, I think we're good. And if you're ready, then I'm ready. And if I'm ready, then let's start. Carrie is a 1976 film directed by Brian De Palma, adapting King's smash hit novel of the same name. Within the canon of King, Carrie is often among his most lauded works. For the unfamiliar, Carrie follows the story of the eponymous social outcast Carrie White and her struggles with an abusive mother, bullies at school, her own burgeoning puberty, and oh yeah, some newly manifested telekinesis, don't worry about that. The film stars Sissy Spacek in what may be one of the most perfect pieces of casting I have ever seen in my whole life. Something about the way Spacek looks just nails the vibe I feel King was going for with this character. She's odd, intense, off-putting, and yet somewhere under all that, almost alien veneer, is a genuinely beautiful and sweet girl just waiting to come out of her shell. Despite me never really having much affinity for the story of Carrie and only finding the De Palma version to be okay when I watched it some years ago, I now completely understand why this story, and especially this film, have remained so popular almost 50 years later. Especially when you compare it to its other adaptations, De Palma's Carrie is just A-class horror filmmaking. They just got exactly what they were supposed to do with the story and delivered on all fronts. The standout of this production is the performances. I had already mentioned Spacek, but I feel everyone hits their marks exactly where they need to. The other highlight being Piper Laurie as Margaret White. Sometimes I feel that Carrie kind of gets an unfair rep as a one-scene movie, but I'd counter that by showing the naysayers any scene between Spacek and Laurie. Talk about horrific. The dinner scene where Carrie confronts Margaret about going to the dance is just one of the most bone-chilling 5 minutes in a horror movie I've ever seen. I could sit here all day and espouse the virtues of De Palma's filmmaking, but to be honest, I think that's kind of boring and would like to set the precedent here. When it comes to the first in a chain of remakes, especially the ones that most people know are pretty good, I'd like to use them as an opportunity to talk about King's themes and how they play into the story, as to better contextualize later entries and explain why they may or may not get what King was going for. With that in mind, you can kind of see the first 3 novels King released as almost foundational texts that would guide his future works, and they're really interesting to dissect and see where he reapplies certain motifs in different scenarios. Carrie is obviously no exception. Within this tale, we can already see King tackle themes of religion, specifically Christian faith, becoming perverted and warped in a modern America. This tends to be a big theme people discussing Carrie latch onto because both King and De Palma are so overt about showing Margaret's religious zeal. Some may interpret it as King being staunchly anti-religious, but as I've heard some people point out, it's more so examining what an organized religion in America does to those who follow every word of it. This is going to come up a lot more later on when we get to Children of the Corn, but I'd like to bring up the idea now because it's prevalent enough in Carrie and every adaptation of it going forward. So Yu-Gi-Oh! YouTuber MBT, bet you didn't expect that poll, brought up on a podcast about King's short story collection Night Shift that King oftentimes wrote about the idea of a profane or warped church. This stems from the idea that all the different / conflicting sects of American Christianity come with the implication that the others are worshipping a false or blasphemous Christ. Most of the biblical quotations that Margaret spews at Carrie are blatantly misquoted or made up to suit her needs. Funnily enough, the only version that actively calls this out is the 2013 version where Carrie just says that those words aren't even in the Bible. I really like King's concept of the false Christ, and it manifests differently across his different works, but in Carrie, I really like it for how it shows what Margaret is doing to Carrie. She's taking something that is supposed to be good and pure, in this case religion, and Carrie, who is a young innocent girl, and shaping them into becoming monstrous and evil and using only to hurt people. She's doing this intentionally, obviously, with her faith, but she's also doing it unintentionally with Carrie. So to simply write off the religious imagery and commentary as edgy 1970s atheism feels just kind of close-minded to me. But I won't deny it is a tad heavy-handed, especially towards the end there, but that doesn't mean I don't like it. In fact, I find the use of it as both a thematic and narrative device is so important to Carrie as a character. It not only defines her as a person, but also influences her actions and motivations from the word go. Within the language of the film, Carrie can be compared to a good number of biblical figures, such as Isaac, Eve, and most plausibly, Job. Carrie is at her core a girl who believes that God is good. Despite suffering both at home and at school from different forms of abuse, she believes that this suffering has to pay off at some point. Something has to change. Yet when we take into account this perversion of the Christian faith, we can see that Carrie is a twisted version of all of the above. An Isaac who God truly wanted Abraham to sacrifice, an Eve who was falsely accused, and a Job who never escapes despair. Carrie's reliance on some higher power to rescue her is a massive linchpin in this story, which leads me nicely into my next theme, the failure of authority figures to protect those that they are responsible for. Carrie is looking to God to take her away from this situation because all of the other people meant to lift her up and make her feel safe have failed. Most obviously being her mother. Time and time again, she fails to build Carrie up and only serves to be her tormentor, mostly because she can't overcome her own mental hangups and would rather take it out on her only daughter. Even at school, we see Carrie repeatedly bullied by the other students, and in the De Palma version, the principal seems to be at best annoyed by what happened in the girls' shower, and at worst apathetic towards Carrie's well-being, not even bothering to get her name right despite being corrected multiple times. Carrie does, however, have one positive role model in Miss Desjardins, the school's phys ed teacher. Desjardins' role in the story is to give Carrie the push to move on and enjoy what's left of her high school years. She sees herself in Carrie, she sees someone who is being taken advantage of, and almost finds it frustrating. In the showers, when all the girls are laughing at Carrie, Desjardins hits her as if it were a reflex. She just wants to get her out of that scenario as quickly as possible, but fails to see how something like that really affects Carrie as it triggers her telekinesis. Despite having the best of intentions, Desjardins still lets Carrie down, because Carrie is more or less already on a path of destruction, and someone somewhere far before this story started should have stepped in to save her. This leads me to our third and final theme of Carrie, and this is probably the most important. A lot of King's work stars young children or teenagers who are about to go through a major change in their lives. In combination with the above-mentioned inept authority figures, these wayward youths are often left to their own devices to figure out the world and, more importantly, themselves. Carrie is an ignorant girl through no fault of her own. This is because information about puberty and the changes young women go through were kept from her by her mother. Margaret White abhors sex, and any mention of it sends her into a crusade to purify her sin-soiled daughter. This is because something that happened relating to Carrie's conception that I don't want to get too deep into now because it's both uncomfortable and not my point. But from this comes a whole host of baggage that she repeatedly unloads onto Carrie, which in turn sends that trauma down the line. The theme of generational trauma is central to a lot of King's narratives, but I'm going to save the further discussion of that for when we get to Salem's Lot. Suffice it to say, not only is Carrie completely in the dark about her own body, she also has to grapple with her mother's mental health, her own self-esteem issues, and her aforementioned telekinetic superpowers. You don't have to be a scholar of the method to pick up on the metaphor of telekinesis equals puberty, but I also don't want to write it off because it is a simple but clever metaphor to use. The point I'm getting at is Carrie is one girl trying to make it out of a terrible situation where she has no hope for escape. Hers is a story of tragedy and woe. Any chance at a fairy tale ending is snuffed out at every corner. At school, she's a social pariah meant to be ridiculed and abused, and at home, she's an antichrist forced to repent for a sin uncommitted by a mother who cannot confront her own inner turmoils. I give all this thematic analysis to give more weight to the one scene of Carrie. I offhandedly mentioned how Carrie is seen as a one-trick pony, but some days I really do get that impression from some people. Even so, when I hear people say that, I almost question if it's even an insult, specifically for the De Palma version, because that one scene is so integral to tying all of this together. The prom is one of the most iconic horror movie sequences, and for good reason. Taking a page out of Alfred Hitchcock's Book of Suspense, we see every detail that goes into planning Chris's prank on Carrie. We see a step-by-step process of the how, when, and why, which gives the film an almost runaway train level of tension. We, the audience, are sat at the edge of our seats, waiting for the other shoe to finally drop. So when it does, oh brother, does it ever drop. De Palma employs an ingenious split-screen shot that has sort of taken on a life of its own. The chaos is overwhelming, and no matter where you look on the screen, you're confronted with violence and bloodshed. Yet, despite the abject horror being presented, you can't find yourself being truly repulsed or elated with what could be perceived as either a horrific tragedy or a bunch of bullies getting their just desserts. You instead get a sense of awe, one that simply compels you to the scene. A feeling that has captivated audiences since 1976. I've already mentioned some biblical allusions that Carrie could be compared to, but one literary one I find interesting is that of Frankenstein's monster, a creature born of the mistakes and misjudgments of its creator, one who did not ask to be given life and in turn was horribly neglected and rejected by both its parents and the world around them. A creature that serves as both a figure to pity and to fear. Carrie's meltdown at the end of her story is as horrifying as it is heart-wrenching. Especially in the De Palma version, you could see this inherent goodness that lies within Carrie. She has the potential to be so much, and yet when she's pushed too far, she snaps, the result of which is the final baton pass in her trauma relay. She gets her revenge on those who mistreated her, those who let her down, and especially those who destroyed her every chance they could. Carrie's rampage feels less like a coordinated strike and more like a primal release. In that moment, she has seemingly no idea what she's doing and is acting purely on instinct. The night concludes with her seeking reprieve in her mother's arms, hoping that if for just one moment in her life, that someone could be there for her in her time of need. And maybe, just maybe, she could have a chance of finding some form of sanctuary. Instead, she's greeted with an attempt on her life at the hands of a wrathful matriarch and is forced to kill the last hope she ever had at connecting with another person. Realizing that she's finally alone, she takes her house down with her and ends her own life. The legacy she leaves is not a lesson for those in her town to learn from, but one of undiluted vitriol. Carrie's resting place is marked with the phrase, "Carrie White burns in hell," pointing downward. In Sue's dream, when she approaches the makeshift tomb, she's greeted with Carrie reaching out to grab her, ensuring that the town of Chamberlain will never forget the night that Carrie White went to prom. She is forever enshrined in the town's memory as the monster that murdered their children instead of one of the kids who fell through the cracks. The tragedy of Carrie is so simple that it hurts. At any point, someone could have stepped in and saved Carrie from her predicament. Instead, people chose to turn a blind eye and allow her abuse to continue indefinitely. Carrie's outburst is one that is understandable but not justified. Yet, it still stings because we, the audience, knows that she has no other framework for dealing with these frustrations and humiliations. From her mother, she learned that when you're hurt, it is God's will that you hurt those who cannot question you. What makes the prom scene so haunting is that you know we didn't have to end up here. You know that if anyone spoke up, this could have all been prevented. But Carrie White is not a Disney princess. She is a movie monster, and her big scene was inevitable. Carrie is ultimately a story about how trauma, puberty, and society's influence molds and warps children in their most formative years. Despite not being what I would call a scary movie, Carrie is a gripping and haunting drama and is most definitely a worthy adaptation of King's work. I had mentioned it at the beginning of this, but I was never really a fan of Carrie in the first place. This is because I tend to read King for his expansive cast of characters and his execution of grand ideas and concepts. For what it's worth, Carrie is just too simple in both cast and concept to really engage me. But that's not a bad thing. While some of King's work rival national epics both in length and scope, Carrie is interesting as one of his more intimate pieces. Less so Ulysses, and more like a parable of sorts. I'd be a liar and a fool if I said that De Palma's Carrie was a bad film, because it certainly is not. In fact, it's quite the opposite. If you're looking for an expertly crafted piece of 70s horror, Carrie is a lot of people's go-to for a good reason. One final note I'd like to make here that we'll see as we progress throughout this series of videos is, I mentioned how above Carrie reads more akin to a parable than a modern piece of fiction. The point I'd like to take away from that comment is how King is such a fascinating author in so much as he has essentially written modern day folklore all by accident. And by folklore, I mean things that are so common that we use as a frame of reference when we encounter similar stories to it. To take an example from a previous author whose work was immortalized in the popular canon, a creature is born of science and soon breaks containment and rampages while leaving a path of destruction. What am I talking about? Well, it could be Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, but I'm actually thinking of Westworld, Splice, Reanimator, and a million other movies because duh, of course we all thought of Frankenstein. That's what I'm trying to hit on. King's work has become so iconic that it's almost began to dominate popular culture's view on certain narrative structures or tropes. If I pitched you the idea, a group of people are isolated somewhere in the mountains and one of them goes crazy and tries to kill the others, almost assuredly you're going to call me out for ripping off The Shining. But look how generic that pitch is. Break it down even further, if I describe a story whose villain is an evil clown, 9 times out of 10 the mental image you conjure up is Pennywise. So what does that mean for us? Influential authors influential, fork found in kitchen, what of it? Well, what it means is we have to look at these films and stories and pick out what people saw in them, because King is very good at creating both a mythos and iconography around his work. The purpose of these videos is to examine what about King's writing is worth adapting and what isn't. An adaptation of a King novel is almost a screenshot into the culture of the time. As we march down the line, you begin to see what about King's work spoke to people when it was adapted, and what changes are made or how focus is shifted to reflect the culture it was released into. Part of the fun of this is seeing all new creators try and adapt something with the cultural ubiquity of the Brothers Grimm and put a fresh spin on it for the time that they're making it for. The cultural context can shape a production while the skeleton of the story remains the same. Adaptational changes are not arbitrary. They're done with purpose and are what interests me the most about this project. For better and for worse, the timelessness of King's work makes it suitable to be adapted at any time, any place, and for anybody, which leads me nicely into... That was nice, right? A brisk breakdown of an all-American classic, no ifs, ands, buts, or coconuts. Yet I hear you cry. Oh, Michael, that was a lovely analysis and all, but where is the slop? Well, my dear friend, look no further, for slop be upon ye. Carrie 2002, which I will just call Carrie TV from now on, is definitely an interesting watch. By which I mean, this is one of the most aggressively 2002 things I have ever seen. All you need to seal the deal is to slap a 30-minute Triple H match and some racist opinions on the Middle East on it, and you're solid. The funny thing about Carrie as a franchise is that it's kind of impossible. By design, Carrie is a singular story about one girl that ends when she dies. There is basically nowhere for this thing to go, yet we live in the Bam Margera timeline from Tony Hawk's Underground 2, so of course we have a thriving Carrie franchise. I jest, of course, but the fact that there are 3 individual films about Carrie or directly relating to Miss White baffles me. As a short aside, The Rage Carrie 2 is the only actual sequel to De Palma's outing, and that started life as a completely unrelated horror film a la every Hellraiser after Bloodlines. That leaves us with 2 remakes, both of which fail to live up to the Spacek-helmed original. Carrie TV is definitely the better of them, but that means about as much as a participation trophy. To save us time, I will spare you any more recountings of the plot of Carrie because across all reinterpretations, the beats stayed generally the same with just some minor deviations. One change in the TV film I enjoyed was an attempt at adhering to the source material via its framing device. In King's original novel, the story is told in almost an epistolary style, much in the same vein as Dracula. Get it? Don't worry, the joke's gonna be a lot funnier in 20 minutes when we get to Salem's Lot. In King's novel, you read accounts of the events through newspapers reporting post hoc and excerpts from the White Commission, an investigative body set up to sift through and possibly cover up the events of the novel. Carrie TV adapts this as a series of interrogations performed by the police to piece together the different perspectives of the survivors. At first, I thought this was a sensible and pretty cool choice to differentiate it from the De Palma version, and then it went away. And then we started to follow exclusively Carrie's perspective, which makes little to no sense. Either do all of this in the flashback or don't do it at all. The worst part is, about 20 to 30 minutes after it seems like they've dropped the framing device, they bring it back. It just feels like an interesting idea nobody wanted to fully commit to because it's difficult to write and film around. If I had to pin down what is exactly wrong with this adaptation, it's that it had a lot of great ideas to follow the novel closer, but clearly did not have the budget nor the skill to pull any of it off. Sometimes in adapting a novel, you just have to cut some things or change them, whether it be specific set pieces or small scenes that don't fit into the pacing of a 90-minute movie. Adaptation is cutting. Sometimes you just gotta go in there and beat Tom Bombadil over the head with a shovel to get to Mordor quicker. A great example of this in the De Palma version is Carrie's rampage at the end. In the 76 film, the destruction is limited to just her school and then she goes home. While in King's novel, she ends up destroying the whole town on her walk back to her house. De Palma limited the carnage to a single location because not only is it cheaper to film, which it was, that's explicitly why they kept it to just the school, but it also allowed more detail to be shown and the damage is a lot easier to quantify. In the 2002 version, they really go for it and try to show you everything and it ends up looking like a CG abomination. Not only does Carrie turn small town Maine into what looks like the hell portions of Doom 3, the effects used to get us there are lackluster to say the least. Despite the attempt at spectacle, it comes off as far less impressive than the De Palma version because everything feels like it lacks any impact. This was a made-for-TV production, and brother, you can tell. Out of every movie we'll be talking about today, this is by far the ugliest. Don't get me wrong, Carrie 2013 is far far worse than this film. But as a thing to put my eyes on, Carrie 2002 offends me on a spiritual level. While I understand this is a consequence of its release, it doesn't excuse it because we have 3 other TV miniseries to talk about and they look perfectly serviceable. The low rent CG doesn't help either. It's very clear that they were attempting to do much more than what was within their limits. And while the chutzpah is commendable, it looks like shit. Not to harp too much on the production side of things, but I do believe that this inhibits a lot of enjoyment that could be found in a retelling of Carrie. In the 76 version, De Palma not only employed a lot of interesting shot choices and strong compositions, but the colors he used worked in favor to enhance and diversify scenes and locations. Certain visuals used by De Palma have become iconic on their own and have built themselves into the mythos of Carrie. In stark contrast, Carrie TV is just a sludgy mess of greens and browns. Nothing in the movie stands out in any meaningful way. My best point of comparison is the prom scene. In De Palma's adaptation, he makes Carrie look very wispy and almost ethereal as she walks amongst the flames, while the TV version just looks like a girl walking around a fire hazard gone wrong. Not only does it strip any impact, it also is just visually boring and causes you to lose interest rather quickly. But don't worry folks, Carrie TV isn't only visually unengaging, it's also narratively unengaging because the script is awful. This is not just solely due to its crushing 2-hour length, but it simply is not as strong as De Palma's. Something you begin to notice watching all 3 Carries back to back to back is how cultural consensus tends to shape the characters. In the original, all of the other girls kind of exist on a near equal level of bad. Personally, I felt as though De Palma was obfuscating Sue's intentions with getting Carrie to go to the prom with her boyfriend. It could be read as someone trying to do something out of genuine penance, or simply a setup for the prank. It could be more obvious than I make it out to be, but that doesn't change the fact that every subsequent adaptation goes out of its way to explain to the audience that Sue is trying to do something nice and Chris is an awful bitch out to basically kill Carrie. I think obvious is the operative word here. Carrie is not a particularly subtle story to begin with, but it feels mildly insulting that every time it gets adapted, I feel like I'm having the morals of the story forced down my throat. It takes a story that acts as a simple cautionary tale and turns it into a morality play. As we mentioned at the end of the last segment, King writes his stories in a way that they're more or less timeless, except for Cell, but fuck it, who cares? Point is, when people have to come in and adapt something that was written 40 years ago for something in the modern day, they're going to update it, regardless of how timeless it really is. This is something we're going to get a really good example of when we get to It 2017, but for now, something I want to impart is that all art, no matter how timeless, is somewhat of its time, if that makes any sense. Like, Carrie is a story that speaks to every kid growing up at some point in their lives across any time, but it is still at the end of the day a book written in 1974. But Carrie TV was made in 2002, adapting something that came from 1974. Therefore, it's going to be more 2002 than it is 1974. Do you get what I'm saying here? That means it carries with it, get it, most of the baggage that comes with being a thing made in the early 2000s. I don't want to mince words here, so I'll lay it out clearly. A bullied teenager with a bad home life finally snaps and takes revenge on the bullies by killing or maiming their classmates plays a lot worse in a post-Columbine world. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think they play into this too overtly in this version, but it's definitely there. The weird school shootery vibes mainly manifest themselves in our main performance, which, well, in online horror circles, Carrie TV is often venerated as not that bad, and a positive most of these types point to is Angela Bettis's portrayal of Carrie. I am not one of these people. Now, that isn't to say that I hate her performance or anything, I just don't like it nearly as much as others seem to. Bettis plays Carrie less like a deer in headlights a la Spacek, and more so a pressure cooker bomb waiting to go off. Carrie in the original is weird with a capital W, but she's also empathetic and you understand what all this is really doing to her. In some cases, the audience can relate to Carrie even if what she's doing is monstrous. But in the TV movie, Bettis comes off a lot creepier and not in a good way. Just from a visual standpoint, they attempt to make it look like she just crawled out of the Black Lagoon. While in the original, Spacek isn't the prettiest girl, but come prom time, she's definitely good looking. I love this detail because it definitely hints that given the right circumstances, circumstances, Carrie had a chance, which further drives the tragedy of what follows. Bettis, on the other hand, always looks like a stereotypical school shooter, and it's hard to connect with her. Carrie is a very passive character, which is why her standing up to her mother is a powerful scene. It's her turning point and hints at the potential that she has. But there are multiple times where Bettis is just kind of a douche to people like Sue. Now, I know that Carrie shouldn't be nice to her exactly, but I think there's a wide gap between Spacek being in denial about Tommy's intentions and Bettis just shrugging off Sue when she offers an apology. It reads a lot less like socially awkward kid trying to get out of a situation and more so like sociopath just trying to get one over on someone she thinks she's better than. I bring this all up because I feel like the baggage that events like Columbine brought to productions like Carrie makes it so that you can't empathize with a character like Carrie anymore, at least in this version. They have to go out of their way to show that she's kind of evil from the start, which I just don't like. It also just makes Carrie kind of a more flat character. There's nothing to really attach yourself to, so she's just kind of there until her big moment happens. It also doesn't help that the performance is just way too over the top. I feel like a broken record mentioning subtlety, but at the heart of everything, that is what I feel like we're lacking with this performance. It reads like a product of the time, and from my position, I can understand that, but it doesn't mean I have to like it. Funnily enough, too much subtlety is what's wrong with the other main performance of this adaptation. Patricia Clarkson as Margaret White is too reserved for her own good. While it could come off as hokey or over the top, you can't deny that Piper Laurie in the original isn't absolutely magnetic. The interactions between her and Spacek are some of my favorite parts of that film, and seeing those scenes done with Clarkson in the driver's seat just feels deflating. Once again, I understand the thought process. You can look at and mock how exaggeratively evil Margaret is in the original, but that's kind of the point. She's not supposed to feel like a real person. She's supposed to be a monster, something nigh unconquerable from Carrie's position of weakness. She's supposed to loom and lord over everything Carrie does. So to play her with all the disinterested affect of Nancy Thompson's drunk-ass mom is just kind of baffling. These two performances combine to create a very uninteresting watch. It just feels like watching two incredibly flat characters try and recite a movie they saw that one time a few years ago just from memory. Bettis plays Carrie the exact same way from minute 1 to minute 200. I don't care if she looks gross, she's boring. Boring feels like the best way to describe this adaptation. Just an ugly, uninteresting, and plotting mess of a movie that feels like it desperately wants to be engaging, but fails on pretty much every front. And yet, this is not the bottom of the barrel for us. While I find this adaptation pretty lame, I could still see some aspects of it worth salvaging, even if they are few and far between. I understand what they're going for here. They were trying to adapt King's novel and stick a bit closer to the source. Now, your appreciation of that may vary, but at least there was some thought going into that. I cannot, however, say the same for Carrie 2013. One of the many questions I hope to find the answer to in doing these videos is why adapt something in the first place? Is it purely for monetary gain, or is there some earnest attempt at an artistic statement that someone believes can only be conveyed through the medium of film or television? Simple fact is, a lot of these adaptations came about due to how popular King's writing is. Yet an unintended side effect of this is what happens when the adaptation begins to surpass the original in popularity. Carrie, conveniently enough, is one of these cases, and through the Carrie franchise, we could see the end product of such a phenomenon. Not to sound hysterical, but Carrie 2013 is one of the worst things I've ever watched, and I'm pretty sure the creators have my phone bugged and have replaced my parents with androids. I joke, but this is actually the worst thing I've watched for this video, and it comes down to one simple fact. This is not an adaptation of the King novel it shares a name with. It is a remake of the 1976 Brian De Palma film. Now, I know some of you out there don't think this is a bad thing. After all, remakes are just a natural part of the modern horror landscape, and they're not all bad, right? Look me dead in my cold, beady eyes when I say this. This is a near one-to-one recreation of the De Palma version. It has absolutely no identity of its own, simply a modern update for the Vine crowd. To keep things short and not bore you with a rehash of my thoughts on the original, I think my issue with this version is that it's just far too clean. From the lighting to the sets to the casting, everything feels way too sanitized to be scary or disturbing. Credit where it's due, in the 2002 version, even if it looked like the bad side of Cal's ass, it was visually off-putting. This version is just far too perfect to have any notable texture. Not to get too stuck in the weeds with how certain actresses look, but if Angela Bettis was too gross looking to play a sympathetic Carrie, Chloe Grace Moretz is too good looking to make me feel bad for her. Now, I want to preface all my critical shit flinging with this. I don't think she's a bad actress. In fact, if you want to see her in a good remake, go watch Luca Guadagnino's Suspiria. However, I do think she's the wrong choice for Carrie, which is not her fault, but whoever put this fucking cast together should be shot. No shit, it just feels like they threw darts at an issue of Tiger Beat and casted whoever they hit. Like, if you told me you got Ansel Elgort, Gabriella Wilde, and Patricia Doubleday together to remake a beloved IP, I'd have jumped for joy because I thought they were bringing Zoe 101 back. It's kind of funny how little I really have to say because my problems pretty much begin and end with I think this is one of the most miscasted movies of all time and it shouldn't exist. But before I find more things to make a stink about, I want to give this remake its flowers in so much as I appreciate that they do something with the time period. They considered that kids these days, 10 years ago, are dumb as fuck and film all of their crimes. So having that play into the prank is actually a pretty good change. Other than that, yeah, I ain't got shit. You see the game last night? Sorry if you wanted a 5-hour roast of a bland, soupy remake of one of the most iconic horror movies of the 70s, but I'm gonna be honest, I'm running on fumes here. This adaptation blows, and I don't feel like filibustering about something I just don't really care about. So I'm gonna cut it short there and jump to something I actually care way too much about. Okay, so I said I wouldn't be reading a lot of these and would just judge the adaptations on their own merits, but I'm lying. Salem's Lot is probably my favorite Stephen King novel, and at that point, one of my favorite books, period. So before getting into this miniseries, I'd like to talk at length about the source material. Published in 1975, Salem's Lot proved that Carrie was not a fluke and that King was here to stay. As a sophomore effort, Salem's Lot is actually quite ambitious when compared to its predecessor. While Carrie was an intimate story about one girl dealing with her own personal struggles, Salem's Lot zooms out and focuses not on one character's arc, but the whole town in which our story inhabits. The scope of Salem's Lot is much wider than that of Carrie's and deals with each citizen's daily life as they navigate routines, school, work, relationships, and an ever-encroaching vampiric menace on the side. Yes, Salem's Lot is the first major work in King's canon to pull one of his favorite tricks. What if classic monster or legend were dropped into the modern day? We're gonna see this again with things like The Night Flyer, The Boogeyman, and Silver Bullet, but Salem's Lot, and by extension these other named works, are much more than What If Dracula at Watergate, or, whatever they were on about in 1976. Instead, Salem's Lot serves as an elegy to the dying American town, an ode to decaying streets leading to empty malt shops and dust-covered elementary schools. It's an almost bitter fuck you to the places that hide their evils to appear civil. Clive Barker wrote in his introduction of the work,
"The novel is not named after the vampire, but after the meat on which the vampire feasts. It is the victim's tale, and it is, in essence, a 400-page suicide note."
With that kind of introduction, some of you might be asking, what is Salem's Lot even about? And before I get to that, I want to posit a question of my own. Why is it that you ask that? Now, the obvious answer is because you don't know and clearly I do. What I mean is, even if you haven't read or seen Carrie or The Shining, you still kind of know what they're about, right? My question on a question then becomes, why is it that Salem's Lot doesn't hold that kind of cultural motion, where simply saying the name conjures up scenes of a telekinetic teen tearing through a town, or a madman stalking his wife and son with an axe in a haunted hotel? Put a pin in that for now while I give some brief plot summary. Salem's Lot is the story of Ben Mears, a semi-accomplished writer who's seeking inspiration in a small town he spent some of his younger years growing up in living with his aunt. In the eponymous town, he intends to rent the Marston House, a gloomy mansion where an awful tragedy occurred some 40-odd years ago. Upon his arrival, however, Ben learns that the Marston House had been purchased by two eccentric European antique dealers named Kurt Barlow and Richard Straker. Ben then takes up residence at a boarding home and begins to write his novel. Along the way, he reunites with old friends like his teacher Matt Burke, and new faces like his love interest Susan. Eventually, the town is shaken to its core when two young children are attacked, leaving the older one catatonic and the younger missing without a trace. From here, a full-on infestation of vampiric ghouls begins to plague the town as our band of heroes search desperately for a way to end the nightmare. Sadly, this summation does not do the novel justice. Salem's Lot is about a million little details intersecting and weaving this tapestry that is the town of Jerusalem's Lot. For all intents and purposes, Ben is our protagonist, but the novel often jumps around to show the lives of a multitude of the town's residents, whether it be the adulteress Bonnie Sawyer and her lover Corey Bryant and the details of their lurid affair, the elementary school students Mark Petrie and Richie Bodden having a fight in the schoolyard, or the investigations of officers Nellie Gardner and Parkins Gillespie who are trying to get to the bottom of the strange case happening in the town. Almost every nook and cranny is given its 15 minutes of fame on the page. While at first this level of detail creates an ass-grindingly slow pace, it is necessary. This is for a multitude of reasons, all of which are spoilers, so if you care that much, get out now because from here on, it's all spoiler all the time. First and foremost, allowing the audience to slowly connect with these characters, even if it is just through these brief vignettes into their lives, makes the ramping tension towards the climax that much more emotionally evocative. As the named characters we've spent a good amount of time with begin to drop like flies, the audience slowly realizes that just because a character has a name and a personality, that doesn't mean that they're safe. The other reasons require a more in-depth discussion of Salem's Lot's themes, so let's clear that up while we're here. Salem's Lot does a lot of its thematic work through the symbol of the haunted house, and more broadly, hauntings in general. Ghosts and haunts are just as much a part of the horror of Salem's Lot as the vampires are. But I don't mean ghosts in the literal sense. Whenever it's described from the outside, the Marston house is meant to resemble your typical Gothic-style haunted mansion. Dark, gloomy, and ever looming. It is an edifice of pain and tragedy, one that the town is forever drawn to like a train wreck frozen in time. Even if the house lays empty for another 1,000 years, the people of Salem's Lot would still revere it as a grim reminder of the evil one is capable of. But the hauntings don't stop at spooky houses. Every resident of the lot is grappling with their own traumas and fears. Hauntings run so deep in Jerusalem's Lot that even its name comes from an old tale about a bloodthirsty pig that stalks the woods, preying on those who dare step foot near it. The novel uses 3 distinct events to get across its point that people or even events can haunt a town. These are the aforementioned story of Jerusalem the Pig, the Great Fire, and Hubie Marston's murder-suicide. The fire is described to us as a massive tragedy that occurred sometime in the 1950s and ripped through the town to the point of almost destroying everything. Many townsfolk recall this event as one of the worst things they had ever seen, and you can almost see it as a marked vibe shift within the town's collective unconscious. More prevalent, however, is the Marston incident, an event so profoundly destabilizing for this town that its setting has remained abandoned ever since. I personally love the use of fire in the Marston house as ways to show the town's collective fears and traumas, but I especially love the Marston house as a sort of shrine to everything that Ben is terrified of. First, as the setting to his traumatizing encounter with what he believed to be the body of Hubie Marston, to what now host Mr. Barlow and Mr. Straker. Barlow and Straker, despite being foreign, are almost natives to the lot. They represent everything that lurks just under the surface of this placid town. King used Salem's Lot as a way to interrogate what he saw as modern day evils, through the lens of an archaic kind of malevolence that just doesn't exist anymore. The banality of evil is an incredibly prevalent theme within Salem's Lot, and necessitates that so much of the book's word count is dedicated to showing how vile these people's lives are, and just how normalized that is to them. Whether it be the young mother who neglects and abuses her baby out of frustration, or the rampant adultery going on within the town, or the children bullying and picking on those weaker than them, cruelty is as natural as breathing is in the lot. In the case of Sandy and her baby, her acts of evil don't even seem intentional, almost as if this rot within the lot has wormed its way into the souls of the residents and has forever changed how they perceive good and evil. The book not only focuses on how this kind of evil is perpetuated, but how it's simply overlooked. Within a small town, nobody seemingly cares enough to intervene when wrong is done, even if it's out in the open, because it could possibly shake the boat too hard and change the decades-long established status quo. Like most small towns, the lot is full of people parroting the old truism of this could never happen in a town like this with people like these. It has deluded itself into thinking that evil is not a domestic issue, but something that is imported. That's why when the Click Boys are attacked, the first 3 suspects are Ben, Straker, and Barlow, all foreigners to the soil, all of them different from those in the lot. Along with the everyday wickedness, there is much time dedicated to how evil itself has supposedly evolved. As a product of its day, King used Vietnam as a direct contrast to World War II. He surmised that back in the day, evil was Hitler killing the Jews, but now it's people fighting a war they never wanted from the treetops somewhere in a jungle most people couldn't even point to on a map. His characters almost mourn the disappearance of the black and white morality they grew up with. They eulogize monsters because at least they had the decency to reveal themselves to you. This dialogue on iniquity in its guises is very ironic when you consider that the main cast is confronted with the most obvious shorthand for evil ass foo ever made in a vampire, and they're just left equally baffled. This is because evil in any form is unnatural. Just because humans are capable of malevolence doesn't mean that we're destined to perpetuate it. So seeing such a blatant and unambiguously capital E evil is actually destabilizing. It draws a direct comparison to Lovecraft's protagonists experiencing insanity at the sight of incomprehensible horrors. But in King's version, the horror is possibly the most understandable. Vampires are like literature's favorite monsters next to ghosts. There's so much written about not only what a vampire is, what it does, and where it comes from, but we also have a bevy of information on how to defeat one. Yet despite all of this, our cast is still shaken to their very core at the mere thought a vampire may or may not exist. In a modern world, a vampire simply should not and could not exist. Our horrors are not curses that afflict our crops, or werewolves that slaughter the innocent en masse, or vampires that abscond with our women to make slaves in their undead army. Our horrors are far too logically illogical. Bombs that waste away the lands they've already destroyed, shooters who murder the defenseless with no motive, and predators who steal our children's innocence. These are modern horrors. We understand them. We almost even expect them. Hell, we live with them. It's that last part that illustrates the full extent of what evil in Salem's Lot is. It's an expected and known quantity that everyone chooses to sweep under the rug and ignore. But as it lay festering under the beds of the lot, it causes a soul-rending corruption to spread slowly and rip all virtue from a place that probably didn't have a whole lot to begin with. From that position, you could almost say Barlow and Straker are the lot's rewards for their hard work. A duo of a charismatic smile that hides behind it a wretched monster. Barlow himself is everything wrong with Salem's Lot made manifest. He is, for lack of any subtlety on my end, evil incarnate. Being immortal, Barlow can go pretty much anywhere he wants. He chose Salem's Lot for a reason. After all, a vampire can only enter your home if you invited them. Barlow feels less like a villain with a motive and more like a force of nature. He comes in, barrels over everything, and just like that, he's gone without a word, almost as quickly as he arrived. I find King's use of the vampire in a modern setting almost endlessly fascinating. Historically, vampires could be seen as representations of peasants' fear of wealthy nobles, but King's greatest strength is taking such well-known horror figures and adjusting them to fit his modern sensibilities. I would say Barlow still has a twinge of that aristocratic horror about him, but I see him more as a representation of the past sins coming back to haunt the present. Barlow is this figure representative of the old world's evils, but he has somehow crossed over into the new world. How is this even possible? The answer is simple, because nothing has ever changed. Barlow as a nigh immortal figure of the devil is part and parcel with the idea that whatever has corrupted the lot has been there long before Barlow's arrival and will remain long after he's gone. The lot has simply given into its vices, which in turn invites Barlow and Straker to set up shop. But it's not just the lot that's like this, is it? Every town is full of people hiding something. Salem's Lot is meant to be any town USA. Communities rise and fall, towns dry up, and yet we all know the same story. Mrs. Johnson just cheated on her husband. Did you hear that the Smiths are beating poor Johnny with a belt? Hey, do you remember that awful murder some odd years ago? So on and so forth. Barlow is scary because Barlow is a reflection of that obscure cruelty so indicative of small town America. He is both a warning about what the skeletons in our closet can become, but he's also a punishment for these sins. In a sense, he's the lot's just desserts. Let's take a step back to something I said earlier in that last bit, about Barlow being a figure of the past come to haunt the present. While this stands as a shorthand for the lot doubling over itself with how rotten it's become, he also is another kind of haunting. It's no coincidence that he resides in the Marston house, something that lords over the vista of Salem's Lot to serve as a reminder of what these people are capable of behind closed doors. This is something King also hoped to relate to a wide audience with. No matter where you live, every town has had its incident. Some awful tragedy that people use to either scare each other or morbidly fascinate their neighbors with. Kids grow up thinking homes are haunted, teens dare each other to challenge their childhood fears, and the adults warn the youth against doing any and all of the above, not only for their safety, but because somewhere deep down, they're afraid too. As we've already discussed, the two tragedies the lot has faced in recent memory are the murder committed by Hubie Marston and the fire that almost claimed the town. Let's tackle the Marston house first. In the 1930s, Hubie Marston, a then unknown mafia hitman, killed his wife and himself and rigged a shotgun pointed at the front door to take anyone who discovered the scene down with him. Sometime in his 4 years living with his aunt, our protagonist Ben went into the house on a dare and seemingly discovered Hubie's body still hanging upstairs. Now, if this is 100% true or not is up for debate. Even Ben doesn't believe what he saw. But for our purposes, either interpretation works. Ben faces his fears of the Marston house and is rewarded with a traumatic experience that haunts him well into adulthood. Either he did see Hubie's corpse, and we have a literal incarnation of the moral rot that has seeped into the lot, perfectly symbolized by Hubie's bloated corpse swinging in the rafters of a decaying house, or Ben imagined he saw a ghost of Hubie, in which it serves to show how events like this tend to linger long after they've ended. A small part of the murder scene I really like is the device that Hubie had set up to kill whomever walked in the front door. This little addition to this gruesome scene says so much about Hubie, that long after he was dead and someone would have done something good and checked in on him, he takes advantage of this neighborly deed by taking another life down with him. Something that serves to highlight that this is not just a man who made a mistake, but a being of pure evil. Something else I love while we're on this topic is when our heroes are searching the whole town for Barlow as we ramp towards the climax, they don't find him in the Marston house. In fact, they find Straker, who's been brutalized and killed, presumably by Barlow, strung up in the attic where Ben would have seen Hubie. Instead, we find Mr. Barlow in the basement of Ava's inn, something to show that this monster is not confined to one scary house on the hill, but under the very pillow that men like Ben sleep on. It's a very terrifying revelation when they figure out where Barlow is, because it almost is a way of him saying, no matter how far you run or what roof you think you're safe under, I will find you. In the same way, long after Ben finally left the lot, Hubie always managed to find him. Now let's talk about that fire. While the Marston incident involved only the victim and the perpetrator, the fire made victims of everybody. Lives were lost, homes destroyed, businesses crumbled, all at the hands of an unthinking, uncaring inferno. The Marston murder had some logic to it. We can quantify that kind of crime if that makes any sense. We can't necessarily rationalize a motive, but we can suss out what happened and chalk it up to Hubie being an evil, evil man. The fire is different. The fire has no motive, no goal, nothing to gain from rampaging through the town. Despite it being some 20 years prior, people are still haunted by what the fire did. There's a collective community trauma regarding the fire. While we could sit here and talk at length about what the fire could mean through this hauntological lens, I want to pose one idea for you to chew on as we get to the filmed adaptations of Salem's Lot. Was the fire a bad thing? So I've talked to your ear off for the last 4 pages of my script about Salem's Lot, the novel. And at the beginning of this section, I hinted that most people were seemingly unfamiliar with the story in terms of the wider scope of popular culture. The question I then asked was, why do you think that is? Personally, I believe the culprit is that Salem's Lot is the first example of King's best work not having an adaptation that matches them in terms of quality or iconography. When discussing Carrie 2013, I briefly spoke about how an adaptation of King's work can overtake the source material in the mind of the general public. The same could be true of a mediocre film causing a really good source novel to fade into obscurity. Now, this isn't to say that either adaptation of Salem's Lot is bad per se, but they definitely aren't good. Both of them have things they do better than the other, and both of them are hampered by the fact that they are 3-hour-long miniseries. And something I want to look at across the two versions is, what exactly about Salem's Lot is so alien to make it seemingly unadaptable? Released in 1979, Salem's Lot, directed by Tobe Hooper, has enjoyed moderate praise and popularity for those who actually remember it ever since it came out. I am not one of these people. For one, I am not in my 50s, and two, this adaptation bored me so hard I actually fell asleep. You gotta understand, I am not one to hit the EPDP like that, especially for something I was watching with my friends. I also am not one easily turned off by slower movies or TV shows. Often I enjoy the ambiance something like that would provide. The issue with Salem's Lot 79 is that there is no ambiance. There is just a distinct lack of sauce in this miniseries, and I feel a lot of that could be chalked up to Hooper's directing. For a while, when I was still conscious, I was wondering why it felt as though we never got a good layout of things, and every scene either felt like it started far too early or ended way too late. Then it hit me. Oh my god, there's no establishing shots in this movie. And from then on, I could not stop noticing it. Without those quiet moments of lingering atmosphere, Salem's Lot isn't able to work its magic like the book does. In the novel, King takes a look at all the nooks and crannies of the town in excruciating detail, so that when we enter the second half, the audience has a clear understanding of the community and can better conceptualize the loss. I understand why Hooper decided to cut this kind of slow burn pacing out and just keep what is necessary. It's because Salem's Lot was never meant to be a mini-series. I'm going to go into detail about this here, but understand that this applies to both versions adapted for television. With the way Salem's Lot proceeds with telling its narrative, a 2-part miniseries is simply not enough. Like, I don't want to call something unadaptable. That's one thing I really want to avoid saying to describe some of these films, because oftentimes King's work has been deemed unadaptable, and I just find that untrue at best and stupid at worst. Okay, the bar is Gerald's Game, right? If we can adapt Gerald's Game and it's good, then any other King story is fair game. The issue is that King's work is not easy to adapt, and as such, adaptations need to know what to keep and what to cut. We saw this in Carrie 1976, which is a superb example of knowing what worked and leaving what didn't so we could squeeze 208 pages into 98 minutes. The problem we now face is that Salem's Lot is 672 pages, and the longest adaptation we have is about twice the length of Carrie. So if I'm so fucking smart, then how would I adapt Salem's Lot? The answer is a TV series, obviously. We need as much time as possible to dedicate to the world building on the front half and the desperate climax of the second. The closest analog I'd use to model after is Twin Peaks, because I make YouTube videos and my heart will fail if I don't mention Twin Peaks every 20 minutes. Seriously though, Twin Peaks is an equally slow and methodical mystery/drama that focuses on the random musings of small-town America. But we again run into a little snafu. Laura Palmer's murder in Twin Peaks occurs about 5 minutes into the first episode and is instantly engaging. The inciting incident of Salem's Lot doesn't happen until about 125 pages into the novel. Up until that point, it's all built up all the time. This is where I could understand people finding Salem's Lot difficult to put on screen. You either need to have some killer dialogue and acting to keep people's attention, or you better be prepared for people to take a nap. The first act of Salem's Lot is slow by design, but your average television audience doesn't care about intent, it cares about entertainment. And if they aren't feeling it, then you won't get the chance to actually get to the interesting stuff. To try and keep this thing on track, instead of fan casting Peter Dinklage as Ben in my HBO series, let's talk about what we actually have. Well, it's clear that we had to do a lot of cutting and a lot of shuffling things around for the sake of clarity. One detail that always stuck out to me is the time Ben actually spent in Salem's Lot as a child. In the novel, he was there for about 4 years in middle school, but in both adaptations, he grew up there through high school. I think why this jumps out to me so bad is that I like the fact that Salem's Lot is not necessarily home to Ben. Within the context of Ben's life, Salem's Lot is nothing more than a footnote, a stopgap in his youth, yet it feels like the closest thing he has to a home. When discussing the major themes of Salem's Lot, I talked about how nothing really changes. Everything that once was will be again, either as something passed down to the youth or confronted as an adult. This is also something that, yes, we will talk about again when we get to it. By the end of Salem's Lot, our two surviving characters are Ben and young Mark Petrie. The obvious reading is that Ben sees himself himself and Mark, and with good reason. Both had moved to the lot in the middle of their childhoods, both are bookish nerds, and both have experienced and survived a traumatic event during their time in the lot. So to change something that little about Ben's upbringing at first seems pretty harmless, but it actually affects readings of certain character relations as time goes on. I understand why they did this though. It's because to a wider audience, especially since it's aired on CBS, just saying this is the town this guy grew up in, he came back to write a book, is a lot easier than saying this guy moved here to live with his aunt in like 5th grade and stayed here for a little bit, but not too long. Then he left again, but is back because he wanted to write a book in the Haunted Mansion. We're going to see a lot of this over the course of our time with these adaptations, because it's almost impossible to adapt King's work without trying to streamline some of it. And with Carrie TV, we've already seen what happens if you don't do that. Things can get a bit confusing. With all this truncating going on, you'd expect this adaptation to be a clearer representation of King's story, but if I'm being honest, it's actually pretty hard to follow. That's because while they cut down a lot of things, they don't supplement them with anything to fill in the blanks. I understood what was going on because I was going off my knowledge from the novel, which is why I was so grateful to have my friends watching with me, because at a certain point, I just flat out asked if they understood what was happening and got a resounding, kinda? The best way I describe it is it's like if someone filmed an outline of a Salem's Lot miniseries. Like they blocked out, okay, we're gonna do this scene here, this scene with the Glick boy in the window here, and so on. This approach makes sense on paper, but so does cooking. The second you start trying that shit for yourself without proper knowledge of how to execute it, it's just turtles all the way down. To take the edge off a bit, I do want to talk about some things I liked in this version. First and foremost, I love how Barlow looks. Is he just Count Orlok? Yes. Do I care? No. He looks exactly as I imagined him in the books, equal parts grotesque and inhuman, but still carrying himself with a sense of dignity and a commanding aura. His encounter with Father Callahan is one of the few truly excellent scenes in Hooper's version. I also enjoyed... No, that's honestly it. A lot of the iconic sequences from the novel just felt very hollow in this adaptation. Something I want to reiterate for both Salem's Lots is neither of them are truly bad, but they are not truly good either. A strong 4 out of 10 for 79 and a decent 5 out of 10 for 04. This makes it somewhat difficult to talk about either in any strong terms because I just don't feel that strongly about them. It sucks how much ended up getting chopped up, switched around, or smushed together across both versions. And trust me, we aren't even through the thick of it yet, because now we must discuss. Second verse, same as the first. It is very hard to make much pomp and circumstance out of sheer mediocrity, but I want to use Salem's Lot 04 as a chance to highlight another tactic used by both series to try and truncate the original story. Salem's Lot is what I would classify as an ensemble cast. Every role, no matter how minor, serves to bolster the overall theme and shape the tone of the piece as a whole. The issue is when you have almost 70 named characters in one novel, any realistic attempt to try and translate that to the screen is gonna have to cut some out. Something both adaptations are guilty of is combining certain characters to try and thrust plot actions on more plot relevant characters. This is for two reasons. One, you just don't want to pay so many actors if they're not going to be that important. And two, you want to cut down on the amount of names someone has to remember when watching something because names stick a lot less easier if you're seeing it on a screen rather than on a page. The first thing that comes to mind is how in 04 they decided to combine the storyline about Bonnie Sawyer cheating on her husband with the stories of Sandy and her baby, and for some reason Dr. Jimmy Cody. To give you an idea of how weird that is, it's like if somebody wanted to cut down Naruto's characters, so they took anything that Killer Bee did, combined it with Choji, and gave it all to Rock Lee. I understand the function, it's just the form that baffles me. It takes a very likable character like Jimmy and turns him into a skeezy doctor taking advantage of a patient and failing to report her abuse. While yes, this does feed into what we were talking about previously about the theme of evil influencing everyday life in the lot, it doesn't deliver the message like you'd think. The point of having such an expansive cast in Salem's Lot is twofold. One of narrative convenience and one of thematic relevance. Narratively, if you name almost 70 characters and then start picking them off one by one, that creates tension. It gives the audience an idea that just because we know a little about the character and have spent a non-insignificant amount of time with them, that doesn't ensure their survival. A wider scope of victims creates a bigger body count, which makes the ending that much starker. The mental image of this once lively town being reduced to a pile of ash with only two left standing being Ben and Mark is haunting and goes to show the utter devastation Barlow's brought to the community. Thematically, a broad cast like this this is meant to show how pervasive sin is in the lot. It's not a case of a few bad apples here. King goes out of his way to ensure you can recognize that the lot is like this down to the core. Beyond this, I definitely don't hate Salem's Lot 04, but it's definitely mid. It has a similar issue to Carrie 2002, where it just kinda looks ugly as fuck. It's like if someone blended up a copy of Hybrid Theory and then just smeared it on an episode of Desperate Housewives. Just really got it up there. Tastes like Bush administration. However, in comparison to the 79 version, it is a million times better, focusing on the main story at hand, and is actually much easier to follow even if you aren't familiar with the source material. Yeah, I'm gonna be honest, I think that's all the praise I got in me. From an outsider's perspective, you would probably think the cast would be a highlight, with names like Rob Lowe, Donald Sutherland, and Rutger Hauer involved, but honestly, their performances are all pretty underwhelming, and I can't fully express how much that bums me out. Rutger Hauer feels especially underutilized. His version of Barlow is less so insane rat man who looks like death itself, and more so overenthusiastic dinner theater actor dreading his 6 a.m. shift at Starbucks tomorrow. Now don't get me wrong, I don't think he's miscast. Hauer is adept at playing villains who are built up only to steal the show for the last 10 minutes. But I am saying they were definitely misdirected in terms of what to do with Barlow. Visually, Barlow is supposed to be the least human-looking humanoid, completely monstrous from first sight, but still recognizably something that used to be a person at some point long ago. Making him look like an aged-up member of the Lost Boys just feels like a galactic bag fumble and actively hurts any menace this character had. I can understand they may have wanted to work the evil can be charming too angle, but that's the whole point of Straker's character. The two work as a pair, almost like an anglerfish. Straker is the enticing warm glow, while Barlow is the monster he's attached to. In this version, Straker's role almost feels superfluous, which is partially why I'm shocked they didn't try to cut him like they did the others. I write this video at a weird time. It is currently August 2024, and much later than that, when I record it. And there's been a remake of Salem's Lot in production for seemingly years at this point, and it just came out like last week, and I haven't watched it because I don't have a subscription to HBO Max, and I don't care. So we're just gonna do that at the end, and I'm gonna make that a precedent rule here, is that if anything gets released over the course of me doing these videos, they're all going at the end. My concern for it is that it's a film, and we already know that a 2-hour feature is simply not enough to do this story justice. My point is that I feel like this thing has disaster written all over it, but we're just gonna have to wait and see. Unless you've already watched it, in which case, I don't know, tell me what you thought about it. I'm open to listen. I like talking to you. Did you catch the game last night? For now, we are left with what we have. 2 lackluster takes on a stellar story. Both fail to live up to the scope or scale set by King's novel, and therefore languish in mediocrity and obscurity. I want to use these two as an example of why I find quality adaptations to be so important. Like I keep stressing, I don't find Salem's Lot to be unadaptable. This isn't House of Leaves we're talking about. What a story like this needs is a dedicated team to bring it to life, and a committed producer who wants to see this reach an even wider audience. And yet, in the era of make a dollar yesterday streaming, sadly I feel like this is a little out of anyone's reach. If you take anything away from this segment, please read Salem's Lot. It is a slow and plodding story, but I swear what you get out of it will be worth it. If reading isn't your thing, then I highly recommend Audible's version. It's a very well acted reading that will only serve to enhance your enjoyment if you aren't already a reader yourself or just don't have the time. Before we fully wrap up here, I want to bring our question about the fire being a bad thing or not back around and ask you what you think. You've had some time, give me your thoughts. Interesting, but wrong. So one thing I failed to really hit on with Salem's Lot is the theme of innocence trying to break through corruption. It's incredibly prevalent throughout most of the text and serves a very simple message. Good will outlast evil, even if it takes forever. The ending is incredibly poignant in conveying this, framing Mark and Ben's exit from the lot one last time as the town burns behind them as equal parts somber and empowering. There are no chains to hold them to this doomed town. They have the capacity to escape and do whatever they want from here. In the end, it shows that even broken homes are hard to leave, but sometimes the only cure to a rotted forest is good old-fashioned fire. This brings to mind the Great Fire of the Lot's Past. What was its supposed goal? Was it an attempt to get in front of what the Lot would become and, in effect, do what Mark and Ben would eventually do? Purification by way of immolation? I find this question interesting because within his writing, King actually uses fire as a capstone to end his novels on multiple times. In fact, all of our stories today end with an inferno. In Carrie, fire represented rage. It showed Carrie's boiling point, and like an angry god, she brought fire upon her abusers. In Salem's Lot, fire represented the necessary purging of the underlying ills of a rotting society. And in The Shining, okay, how do I approach this topic? So for the uninitiated amongst you, The Shining is a movie, and that's good enough. Look, what do you want me to say? Stanley Kubrick's The Shining is possibly one of, if not the greatest horror movie of all time, featuring knockout performances from Jack Nicholson, Shelley Duvall, and Danny Lloyd. It's expertly paced, masterfully shot, and dread-inducing whether it's your first or 50th time seeing it. That's all well and good. We know that, but this is a video about adaptations, and is specifically the reason I outlined that little rule about judging an adaptation on its own merits and not based purely on accuracy. This is because, very famously, Kubrick's Shining is incredibly different from the source material. So much so that King has gone on record multiple times saying he doesn't like Kubrick's version all that much. Which of course makes him a know-nothing dullard who should be drawn and quartered for bad movie opinions. I spit on you, stupid author man. Ew, it got on my fucking keyboard, ew. Okay, so I'm gonna do something brave here and stand up for the millionaire, most financially successful author of all time and say, look, I don't think King is entirely wrong. Rational response, I understand. But seriously, I think most people hear Stephen King hates The Shining and immediately come to the worst conclusion possible. But if you actually listen to what the man is saying about Kubrick's film, it's not all that bad. He actually draws a lot of interesting comparisons between his novel and the movie, and I'll save a lot of that for our final segment because it's easier to get into once we establish context. For now, let's just praise one of the most highly acclaimed horror movies of all time and see where that gets us. There are 5 movies that I believe are inalienable from pop culture's consciousness. They are The Wizard of Oz, Casablanca, Jaws, The Exorcist, and The Shining. These movies are so baked into our cultural DNA that they might be part of our actual DNA. I am convinced that every child is born with a Nicholson impression locked and loaded. To give an example of The Shining's cultural dominance, the line "Here's Johnny" is more famous for being a thing in The Shining than it is the thing from fucking Johnny Carson, where it originated from. Like, that's not saying Johnny Carson's some obscure thing. He's like one of the biggest names in late night ever. He's the late night guy. It's just that's how big The Shining has become. This is a long way to say that The Shining is one of those impossible to talk about movies that is just so perfect in every second of its runtime that it makes you look stupid trying to hash out why it's good. It's like trying to explain why people like cake. The only reason you do it is either A, you're a fool, or B, you're an alien. Yet, it's my job to try and explain the inexplicable, so glit glorp, here I go. The Shining is about the Torrance family, Jack, Wendy, and their son Danny. Jack is a recovering alcoholic and aspiring author, and he decides to get away from everything with his family by taking up a position as the winter caretaker of the Overlook Hotel. The problem is, the hotel is haunted and their son possesses a strange ability known only as the Shine. What ensues is dread, terror, and a lot of screaming as Jack makes his descent into lunacy and tries to uproot his family tree from this garden of madness. Okay, bring on the peanuts. Thank you. So The Shining is obviously about much more than what I described, but that in and of itself is a can of worms. The Shining is as obtuse as it is famous. The best comparison I have for it is, funnily enough, Eagles' Hotel California, both of which are super popular, but also nobody knows what the fuck they're about. This has led to a myriad of interpretations from faked moon landings to the genocide of the Native Americans, all of which are as plausible as they are absurd. Something a lot of people will tell you when talking about this movie is to also watch Room 237, a documentary about fan theories regarding Kubrick's film and what it could possibly mean. I'm not going to do that. In fact, I actively warn against viewing that trash. The issue is that Room 237 comes off as platforming weird conspiracies instead of being a place to actually discuss ideas about what Kubrick was trying to say through his movie, which leads us to what I think. For me, what makes The Shining so ripe for conspiracy is just how simple it is. Much like Hotel California, it's an incredibly tight and well-crafted piece of art that is just mysterious enough to offer room for interpretation. With both being as mainstream as they are, this leaves them open for a lot of cranks to start throwing any ideas they had floating around at it. Personally, I see The Shining as the tale of a man becoming what he always was. Rare as they may be, a common critique I hear from detractors of The Shining falls mostly on Nicholson's portrayal of Jack. These critics will often talk about how over-the-top and borderline campy his performance can be at times, stating something along the lines of, "He seems crazy from minute one," to which I reply with, "What if he is?" I really love this reading on Jack's character because it adds so much tension to every scene he's in with Danny and Wendy when things are supposed to be calmer and more domestic. Nicholson's affect always comes off as unsettling, like he's trying to blend in. This obviously plays in with his alcoholism and abusive tendencies towards Danny especially. The clearest example of this is when he injures Danny after a night of drinking. While meant to set up how he has this violent streak in his past, it also is a glimpse into what the Overlook will allow him to be. The metaphor for alcoholism in King's novel is effective if not a bit obvious. The hotel equals drinking equation works so well because we're able to see what both do to Jack and draw conclusions from there. However, in Kubrick's version, it's less so what the hotel changes in Jack and more so what it reveals about him. In possibly one of the most talked about lines in the film, when Jack confronts Delbert Grady in the bathroom, he repeatedly tries to put the onus of being the caretaker onto Grady, especially after hearing the stories about him from Ullman. Grady responds, denying that he's the caretaker, and states that Jack is the caretaker now. He's always been the caretaker. Now, this has spurred on countless fan theories about Jack's relation to the Overlook, and people have ascribed all sorts of mystical properties to said relationship, but if you look at it in its simplest form, what Grady is saying is that Jack has always been like this. They use the story of Grady killing his family early on to foreshadow what Jack is going to do. The idea we're supposed to get from this is that the caretaker will inevitably hurt his family in some way. Similarly, an alcoholic will hurt those they care about while also killing themselves, whether directly or indirectly. Jack hears about Grady and shrugs it off in an "it could never be me" kind of way, almost echoing that same thought process most addicts go through when they believe their addiction holds no power over them. Jack has always been the caretaker, because Jack has always been like this long before he ever heard of the Overlook. Something I felt stupid only realizing recently is how this connects to one of Danny's most famous scenes. Throughout the film, he's heard muttering red rum as a vocalization of the premonitions Tony is providing him. While this is written off initially, it's not until we enter our climactic chase that we see him scribble red rum on the walls and its true meaning is revealed. Watching this again for the video, I'm sitting there like borderline smacking myself on the noggin because it's writing on the walls. They're finally seeing the writing on the walls, literally. Also, dumbfuck moment number 2, red rum, it's liquor, like the thing that Jack's addicted to. How did I fucking learn how to draw? I'm fucking stupid. Sometimes I question how I'm able to tie my own shoes. Anyone with an objective perspective on the Torrance situation could tell you that Jack was a danger to his family. Yet, Wendy's good nature and faith in her husband blinded her to this fact. It's how Jack has been able to get away with as much as he has, with false promises and half-hearted attempts at reconciliation, desperately accepted by a spouse who just wants the man she loves to come back to them. Where Kubrick and King's perspectives on the matter differ is in their sympathies to Jack. Kubrick portrays Jack as a wild animal who's barely holding on to his civility in the first place, just well kept enough to dissuade any suspicions that he's a monster. The Overlook afforded him a playground where he could let it all go and become what he had always wished he was. This is echoed in the final shot of the film where Jack is seen at the forefront of a party dating back to the early 1900s. In the frame, Jack is elated and forever immortalized in this house of pain. The purpose of Kubrick's The Shining is to give the audience a glimpse into an abusive household. Authors will often use the imagery of a haunted house as shorthand for a broken home. In fact, King has previously used this in Salem's Lot, and will do so again in the future, many, many times. The Overlook is a quintessential haunted house in both form and function. It's the perfect backdrop to this domestic tragedy as it stands almost aloof to the horrors occurring within. A very common thing you'll hear in stories about haunted houses is the house feels like a character itself, and that much is true of the Overlook. But in comparison to something like The Haunting, the Overlook feels less like a dreary or sad place and more like an instigator who doesn't care what happens next. It is Jack's vice and his enabler, pusher and partner in equal parts. This is seen very literally when the ghost of Lloyd offers Jack a drink, tying together a metaphor from earlier in a neat little bow. Something that is also debated hotly in reference to Kubrick's adaptation is the veracity of the Overlook's haunting. Most will claim that everything in the film could be chalked up to a psychosis set on by cabin fever, all except for how Jack got out of a locked pantry. Personally, I fail to see the importance of this. I bring it up because I'm interested in how much focus this gets in the grander discussion of this film, when it kind of doesn't matter. I'm always interested in people who focus on the least important question in a movie or a game, like the leagues of pseudo-intellectuals and Ridley Scott, who really want Deckard to be a replicant in Blade Runner. Why does that matter? Who cares if the Overlook is or is not haunted? What does this add to The Shining as a story? For the purposes of our characters, they see ghosts, and the Overlook is haunted, done and dusted. What I'm trying to say here is that Kubrick's Shining is a near flawless movie that people have analyzed to death. So other people feel the need to try and read into what was never written and glean something new from that. While I appreciate the attempts at understanding art on a deeper level, I feel a lot of it is coming from well-meaning idiots who don't actually want to understand The Shining. They want it to say what they're thinking. The Shining is, at its core, an incredibly personal story about addiction, abuse, and the pains of a family falling apart in real time. And to see that get co-opted by cranks trying to put themselves over just feels icky in a way. But beyond those kinds of people, this movie's a 10 out of 10. It's basically perfect. Like, the sets look amazing, the actors do everything they need to and more, the effects are amazing, and I completely understand why Stephen King doesn't like it. So, for the uninitiated amongst you, The Shining is a miniseries, and that's good enough. The Shining miniseries is one of the most maligned King adaptations. Ask almost anyone about it and they'll either say, what do you mean there's a miniseries? Or, isn't that the one where Danny gets jumped by a shrub? Or, how did you find this address? I thought I had filed that restraining order properly. They never expect my answer on that last one. It's a 4-part knock-knock joke that ends in a limerick. Point is, this adaptation is either lost to obscurity or wholly unloved. I'm here to play defense, because if I'm being honest, I don't hate it. Now, is it better than Kubrick's? No, and you're stupid for asking. Go to the stupid baby corner and think about the stupid words coming from your stupid mouth to my divine ear and fucking cry. Unlike previous entries here, I actually want to start with the bad because I think there's more good than bad, and that's what I want to focus on. First things first, this shit is too long. The average King miniseries is about 3 to 4 hours, with the idea that it's supposed to be 2 90-minute to 120-minute episodes aired across 2 weeks. This is the structure for Salem's Lot, It, and countless others. Watching them now, it's a bit more difficult because a 3-hour movie is a big ask even for masters like Scorsese, so I sure shit am not devoting that kind of time to Mick Garris if I weren't being paid for it. The Shining miniseries clocks in at a corpulent 4 hours 30, which is too damn long, and they should feel bad about it, like actually fucking really bad about that. So much of the runtime is taken up by expository dialogue and focuses on random details about the inner workings of the Overlook. We have a no shit near 10-minute scene of Ullman explaining to Jack how to maintain the boiler. Now before you get up in arms, yes, despite not wasting my parents' money to go to theater school, I know what Chekhov's gun is. I know the point of understanding how important maintaining the boiler is to set up our climax. I get that. The point I'm trying to make is they deliver it in such a dry and uninteresting way. The goal of exposition is to not let the audience in on the fact they're being exposited at. Failure to do this means you're being boring and you need to go back to the drawing board. I feel as though this could be chalked up to the 2 leads of this adaptation. First is director Mick Garris, who will be a recurring figure through these videos. Garris is famous for adapting a lot of King's work for the small screen, and he's an okay director. He has some good ones, some bad ones, and some really bad ones. There are 3 directors we will draw specific focus to based on the volume of their output and the quality of their work. Garrus is the first of these. The other hat on this 2-headed monster is King himself. Yes, the big Steve hopped down from his piles of money to write an adaptation of his own novel. While this may seem strange, something you just have to get used to is that King loves putting himself in as many adaptations as possible. He has a cameo in so many of his fucking movies, it makes looking through his IMDb a mess. Look, he's even in this one. Look at him, jiggling. Something else you should get used to is that if a movie or miniseries has written by master of horror Stephen King on it, you should approach it with the caution reserved only for brown recluse spiders. A grand majority of what this man has written to be filmed is absurd and smelly. This doesn't mean that the Shining miniseries is either of these, but what I'm saying is it's really obvious that a novelist wrote this. That plotting exposition that is very dialogue heavy and visually uninteresting is almost beat for beat how someone would write it in a book. As the series goes on, however, I feel they pick up a lot of the slack and it becomes more watchable, which is damning with faint praise if I've ever heard it. Other things on our checklist of crap is the kid that got to play Danny just isn't very good. Most people would say they're above making fun of children, especially in show business. I'm not one of these people. This kid fucking sucks. Okay, that's harsh. Actually, I'm of the opinion that a child's performance in a movie is entirely dependent on the director. Now, I know this is gonna break some hearts here, but remember, I love you, okay? Now, Mick Garris is not a better director than Stanley Kubrick. Shh, it's okay, baby. It's okay to cry. I got you, okay? I know it's hard. Just let it all out. Just let it all out, okay? Shh, okay. For real though, I am just not a fan of this version's Danny, and I'm only lukewarm on its Wendy, so we're kind of 0 for 2 here. The whole production just pales in comparison to Kubrick's version. The Overlook feels less monolithic, which hurts its ability to induce dread. Something that always fucked with me about Kubrick's Shining is how I could never truly get a layout of the Overlook in my head, despite the multiple scenes showing Danny riding through the hotel. Something about the way the film is edited and how the camera tracks Danny just throws me off so that I can never really get my bearings, which I feel has to be somewhat intentional. As for Garrus's take, I have a pretty good idea of what the Overlook is supposed to look like and where everything is. It feels too stagey, if that makes sense. The whole deal is brought down by the fact that it's made for TV miniseries and not a $19 million Warner Brothers production. Which leads me to the effects. Look, I think the reason a lot of people latch onto the whole "is the Overlook actually haunted" thing is because Kubrick got so much out of so little in that movie. All of the scares are done by building dread and ramping tension, 2 things you don't need a lot of VFX to pull off. Now look at the wretched CG in the miniseries, and you could see why people always laud the subtlety of Kubrick's vision over the bombacity of whatever this is. Like I had said, King is someone really adept at writing for page, but on page, things like a killer fire hose can be made to seem scary since you have to create the mental image in your head, along with the fact that King is able to give you, the reader, insight into what his character is currently thinking of this situation. The miniseries can't do that shit. It just cannot. I'm sorry, but shrubs are not scary. In fact, none of this is scary. Honestly, I think that's a lot of people's biggest problem. Despite how much time they have to build up tension and create an atmosphere, they just don't. Which, if you haven't been clued in yet, mood and tone is what made The Shining so effective in the first place. Yet that isn't to say this version isn't effective. I don't see the 1997 miniseries as really a horror, but a drama. And that is all thanks to one man. Steven Weber's performance as Jack Torrance is honest to God amazing. This man understood exactly what King wanted to portray with this character, and he knocked it out of the fucking park. Something we discussed as a major reason why Kubrick and King differed on this story comes down to how they sympathize with Jack. Kubrick seems both scared of and disgusted by what Jack does and who he truly is, while King is supposed to be Jack. I've been using a simple question to explain how I view the differences in interpretations between King and Kubrick. Who is the main character of The Shining? In Kubrick's film, the protagonist role is split between Wendy and Danny. We follow their arcs and root for their survival, and for the most part, all of the horror is derived from the threat that Jack and the Overlook poses to them. Wendy's growing fear and suspicion of Jack is the driving motivator of the plot, and she or Danny are the ones actually moving the plot forward, while Jack is an obstacle. In the miniseries, and by extension, King's novel, Jack is clearly the main character. This is because The Shining is originally a story about how addiction can take over someone's life and change them for the worst. I understand where those critics who write off Nicholson's performance are coming from, because if you go into Kubrick's interpretation with the novel in mind, yeah, they kind of do Flanderize Jack. What makes Jack an interesting character in the miniseries is that he is complex. He clearly doesn't like what's happening to him, but he's also powerless to resist its allure. There's more of a tragedy to his downfall than in Kubrick's version. You feel him slip away as he becomes more curt and angry, and you can see it on Weber's face that this is hurting him too. It's genuinely amazing to watch play out and is an absolute highlight of something that is so often written off. Another thing I really enjoyed about the miniseries is that it actually does something with Danny's ability to shine. Isn't that weird? Like, the movie is called The Shining and it feels like the shine is only there so Danny can act weird. We have a reason for Dick Halloran to show up and kick off Act 3. In the miniseries, they play with the idea that everyone has the potential to shine, and more likely than not, Jack is actually really adept at using it, but he just doesn't understand it. That's why the Overlook is able to speak to him so easily, unlike Wendy. I like this because the way Dick explains it, the shine is a good thing. It is an inherently positive force, as we'll see in Dr. Sleep, but it can be taken advantage of. I like this because it shows that inside, Jack has the potential to be the good father and husband he wants to be, but he has too much baggage and not enough help to properly parse through it all. I called the miniseries a drama, but I think a melancholy would be more descriptive. It's heart-wrenching watching Jack go through his struggles and in turn put his family through the same, if not worse, pain. These emotions feel heightened when you realize that the impetus of The Shining comes from King's fear of his own alcoholism and what path that might lead him down. It's a very honest truth spoken from an addict at the time. I know we clown on him now for using the alcoholic writer with a dark past archetype too much. Literally, look at my handle on Twitter right now. But I gotta give it up to him because it could not be easy writing something like this with that on your mind. It's a very raw, emotional, and naked portrayal of addiction through an addict's eye, and to that, I can't fault the guy. I feel like this is what makes the jump to the miniseries the best, and it's clear that King wanted that to be the focus above all else. This is seen especially in the ending. In an interview with David Letterman, King mentioned that he and Kubrick saw The Shining in almost opposites, and cited the ending in particular. I think Kubrick's ending is great for what the story was going for. It's a neat little spin on the original, but I don't think it's better than King's. Which is funny because King has this reputation of being a great setup guy, but always fumbling right at the goal line. To set the stage, at the end of Kubrick's film, Jack freezes to death in the hedge maze after losing Danny, but in the novel/miniseries, Jack is able to fight off the Overlook's influence long enough to overheat the boiler and cause an explosion that burns the Overlook to the ground, killing himself in the blast. I really enjoy how this ending was portrayed by Garris, and especially what Weber was able to put into his performance here. You can see Jack fighting back all of his darkest urges to do the last thing he possibly can to save his family. It's a brutal and upsetting ending to this character, and yet it's also a very positive end to his arc. Bittersweet would just be an understatement. I like it because it changes how the audience looks back on Jack through the story. For Kubrick, it's portrayed like Wendy and Danny survived Jack in the Overlook, while in King's world, Jack is able to make sure that his family can live a happy life even at the cost of his own. As someone who works with addicts, a very common thing you'll hear as a warning when talking with them is that they have a tendency to be very self-centered and selfish. This is just the nature of the beast and definitely not true of all addicts, but from personal experience, yeah, I see it. The point of King's ending is to show that Jack always had that good inside of him. He's able for one moment to perform a selfless act and overcome his demons in hopes of saving his family. I think it's incredibly poignant and makes the final scene at Danny's graduation hit that much harder as we see that Jack did love his son and is hurt that he couldn't have been a better father. Something about it just resonates with me much more than the frankly dour ending in Kubrick's version. I had said that fire in each of King's endings represented something powerful about the preceding narrative, and for The Shining, I think it is a symbol of a burning love for someone else. Jack's fire burned strong enough to cast out his demons and give him one last moment of clarity. He's able to see clearly through all the smoke and is able to, for one last time, light a fire that will shine forever in the hearts of those he loved and died for. I don't think it redeems him, but I think it shows that he wasn't a monster. It shows that he was human. Out of everything we've talked about today, I would say the 1997 Shining miniseries has been the one adaptation I've thought about the most. Not because it's my favorite or anything, and not because it's particularly bad, but it is the most interesting. This is a peak example of an honest-to-God interpretation bucking the trends of a previously popular adaptation of the same source to try and do something different, and goddamn it, I gotta give it its flowers because nobody else will. Now, does that make the miniseries good? Well, results may vary. If you're able to stomach the glacial pace and abysmal effects, yeah, I think it's worth a watch. But if you can't, I wouldn't judge you. I urge everyone interested to go in with an open mind and a cleared schedule, because you might just find something worth salvaging from this flaming wreck. Where does that leave us? Well, with approximately 69 adaptations left, I say we got our work cut out for ourselves. Honestly, I now understand why those iceberg videos and entire series reviewed things spend at most like 10 minutes per topic, because holy shit, this took a long time. I want to reiterate that I'm not sure we're gonna finish all these, but I had a really great time going through all of these adaptations so far, and I hope you had a good time watching. At the end of each episode, I want to keep a running ranking so we can keep track of if these are getting any better. So currently, from best to worst, we have The Shining 1980, Carrie 1976, The Shining 1997, Carrie 2002, Salem's Lot 2004, Salem's Lot 1979, and Carrie 2013. For our Special Boy Award, which is an award I just made up for the most surprising adaptation, I'm gonna give it to The Shining 1997 for being way better than I thought it was gonna be. Seriously, I thought this was gonna be bottom 2 for sure. With that, I think I've talked your ear off enough, so go out, my friends, and spread the knowledge you gained from this video, if any. And seriously, if you haven't, go read Salem's Lot and let me know what you thought in the comments. This video took a lot of effort to put together, and while I'm still in school, my output is gonna be very slow. So if you like this video, please consider giving this a like and subscribing, because it did mean a lot to Pat and I if you guys enjoyed the first step in a true passion project. And hopefully I can get something else out real soon before things get too hectic. So thanks for watching, and remember, my name is Michael. Let's talk again real soon. Hey, this is Michael at the end of the video and the little credits thing. So I got sick, I think twice, trying to record this video, and this video has been delay after delay. And I really want to try and get it out around or on Halloween. So if that happened, yay. If it didn't, boo, that sucks. There's nothing we could have done. If I sound weird in this video, that is completely why. I'm still coughing up a lung, trying to power through it. I just want to get this thing done. And I hope you really enjoyed it. I genuinely do. I had a lot of fun making it, and I really want to see where this goes and what kind of opportunities we get from doing this kind of video. And let me know if you thought some things worked, some things didn't, and we'll go from there. So yeah, thanks for watching.